This video discusses how to reconfigure a chassis from a workbook and how to use chassis or logical switches as templates using the FOS API. Enterprises with a cyclical business model may want to use these scripts to quickly reconfigure their SANs. The legal disclaimer is sure for you to read. Comments, questions, and feedback are always appreciated, and I'm available for consulting. Follow the GitHub link at the bottom of the page for a copy of this presentation and the scripts described herein. As with all of these presentations, additional information can be found at the bottom in the handout notes. Although primarily intended to use other switches as a template, this script can be used to restore or repurpose a chassis as well. A mapping function, therefore, allows you to change the fabric name, the fabric ID, the switch name, and the domain ID. The nomenclature used herein is that restore refers to the chassis that you're restoring from, and target refers to the chassis that is being built. Although there is some overlap with the config download and config upload FOS commands, the restore script was really designed as a template. So the target switch, it does not have to be the same type of switch as the restore switch. You have greater flexibility in what you want to restore. You can modify the switch name, domain ID, fabric name, and fabric ID. And this is a best effort. It'll do as much as it can, and if it runs into any error, it reports them but keeps right on running. These are your login credentials for the target chassis. -I is the name of the captured data file that you're going to use for the restore chassis. -WWN tells me which chassis is in that input file. -P, we're going to talk about that a little more in the next slide, but that defines what it is that's going to be restored. -FM is your fabric map. We're going to discuss that again in greater detail. -Scan, this is what tells you what's in that captured data file. And -EH, that's your extended help. I recommend starting with the -EH option. The -P option is used to define what gets restored in the target switch. When specifying a CSV list of actions for use with -P, the order doesn't matter. Certain things, such as moving ports to a logical switch, requires the switch to be created first, so the order of actions is predetermined. Redundant actions are removed. This is roughly the order in which the actions are taken. Diving into these details is beyond the scope of this video. So, asterisk, well, that's everything. Do a full restore. VFC tells me to clear out all the logical switches and restore all the ports back to their factory default. VFS, that's restore all the virtual fabric switches, all the virtual ports, all the chassis parameters, all the switch settings. The difference between VFS and S is that virtual fabric switches, you're just creating the logical switch. You're not configuring the switch, whereas S configures the switch. P, that's kind of like S. That's what configures the ports. VFP does not configure ports, just moves the ports over into the logical switch. Maps copies all of the custom rules, policies. It does not touch the default rules. U, that sets up all your non-default user accounts. Z is zoning, that does all your, restores all of the zoning. You have the ability to enable a zone configuration when you run this script. And E just says enable everything that was enabled in the restore switch. This is just here for reference. The fabric map is best explained with some of the examples that follow. Rather than clutter the examples with repetitive options, substitute these parameters every time you see -common. I usually use the restore all.py script to generate the correct command syntax, and we'll cover that later. These are here just for reference. Now, with the -scan option, you don't need to put the login credentials of the target switch. I recommend doing so that you get that target switch into that output. This is an example on how to copy maps policies from one switch to another. Note that there are only two parameters in the FID map. Since nothing is being done with virtual fabrics, there's no point in having a full CSV list of all parameters. They would just be ignored anyway. This is also a good introduction as to how the fabric map works. So here we said, take whatever in the restore switch in FID1 and apply that to FID1 of the target switch. And those actions are specified by -P. Again, take FID1 of the restore switch, apply that to FID2 of the target switch, and again, FID1 to FID3 of the target switch. Now here the only action we're taking is maps. There's another way of doing this. You could specify a range. So what we're doing here is we're taking FID1 of the restore switch, and we're going to apply that to everything in this range. So in this case, FIDs 1 through 3. In this example, we're going to copy maps policies from FID1 of the restore chassis to all the FIDs in the target chassis except for FID 128. This is a convenient way to replicate custom maps definitions to all FIDs without having to determine the target FIDs in advance. Except when creating logical switches, the target FIDs are automatically determined and only existing FIDs are used. You will get a warning message indicating that FIDs don't exist, but there's no consequence. Since this script will do whatever you ask it to do, this is a good time to stop and point out some of the things that you don't want to do. In this example, a logical switch FID1 would be created in the target chassis with the same fabric name, switch name, and DID as the restore switch. It would then move all the ports matching the ports in the restore switch that was created in FID1 to the FID1 of the target switch. The script would then create FID2, which would succeed, but setting the switch name would fail because switch names must be unique in FOS. So it would retain the default switch name. It would then set the ID to the same DID for the restore switch. Then it would move all the ports that were just moved into FID1 over to FID2. The script would continue to create logical switches and move ports in this manner until the maximum number of logical switches supported for the target chassis was reached. Thereafter, it would continue to attempt to create remaining logical switches, but each attempt would fail. FOS may terminate the session due to an excess of errors. In this example, I'm going to repurpose the chassis. I'll keep all of the chassis configurations. I'm just going to reconfigure the logical switches. Specifically, I have two logical fabrics that I'm going to recreate in the target switch, but I want to give them different names and IDs. So VFC says clear out all the logical switches in the target switch, recreate the virtual switches with all the ports, configure the switches, configure the ports, copy all the maps policies, and enable the switches and ports when I'm done. Now let's set up the fabric map. The methodology is the same for both switches, so I'm only going to go over the second switch. So I put a semicolon in there to separate the two maps. This is the restore FID 3. I'm going to recreate that as FID 13 in the target. I'm going to assign this name fabric backup odd fabric in the target switch. I'm going to give it a domain ID of 41, and I'm going to name the switch switch_41. This is pretty straightforward. All logical switches are deleted, all ports are set to the factory default, and a full restore is performed. Building command lines with all of these options is tedious, so I created batch files. I created this script because I got tired of manually building all the batch files during test. Continued to be convenient for me, so I assumed others would find it an easy way to generate command lines as well. Often I just copy and paste a single command line I need out of the output. It takes the management interface IP address from the captured data, which will have all X's except for the last octet unless you use the -NM option when capturing the data. It also takes the -WWN parameter from the captured data file. All other parameters are replicated in the output. In Windows, start means run whatever follows in the background, while in Unix, the equivalent is the ampersand sign. There is also a script to configure switches from a workbook. These workbook templates are in the Brocade REST API applications folder. Copy the one that matches the switch type that you want to configure. Editing these workbooks is covered on the subsequent slides. There's an instructions worksheet, a chassis configuration worksheet, a switch configuration worksheet, which can be copied when creating multiple logical switches, and a port configuration worksheet. Typically, network settings are configured via the CLI during installation, and all other default values are kept. I saw no need to have a sheet for chassis changes until I started using the script and realized setting the chassis name is a common configuration task. So I shoehorned in this sheet. I'm not going to go over all the details of how it works. If you want to name the chassis, put your chassis name in there. If you don't want to name the chassis, just leave the cell empty. Typically, I modify the SwitchX worksheets, make copies of them when configuring multiple logical switches. There are some seldom used switch settings that are not covered, but all the common ones are in here. Fixed port switches only have one port worksheet, but director class switches have a port worksheet for each slot. The did and fid cells autofill based on the previous value, which is from the bottom up. So keep that in mind when you're tweaking this worksheet, making edits. So the FID must match one of the FIDs in one of the switch worksheets. If a matching FID in one of the switch worksheets is not found, it's ignored. So that's a good way if you're only trying to configure one logical switch and you want to ignore the others. You just leave the worksheet for that switch out. It does make sure that the domain ID matches. This attached device column, you can use this for comments. It's ignored. This is the user-friendly port name. So depending on how you configured the port naming conventions on the switch worksheet, this port name will be applied. You don't need to make any other changes on this worksheet. And thank you for watching.